Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Storm in the Village by Miss Reed. It was on the following day that Miss Jackson burst into school in a state of great excitement. I was glad to see her so happy, for ever since the day of the flower show she had gone about her affairs in an unnaturally subdued manner, and I had felt extremely sorry for the girl. I was also much perturbed in my own mind about speaking of her infatuation for John Franklin until I had learnt more from Miss Clare. And as that lady was looking so frail, I felt diffident about worrying her unduly. As I have a horror of stirring up emotional upsets and very much dislike receiving confidences from overwrought individuals who will doubtless regret their own disclosures as soon as they have come to their senses, I have so far kept silent on this matter. But it had given me many uneasy moments, and I wished to goodness that either Miss Jackson's affections could be engaged elsewhere, or that John Franklin could find employment at a distance, preferably in another hemisphere. "I've had such a wonderful letter from Miss Crabbe," exclaimed Miss Jackson ecstatically. "She wants to come and spend next weekend here. Isn't it lovely?" I said that would be very pleasant indeed for both of them. And where was she going to stay? "Of course Miss Clare can't manage it," said Miss Jackson. "I wonder if the Beetle and Wedge would put her up, or the Oak at Beech Green." I suggested that she should go down to the Beetle during the dinner hour and see what could be done. It was already 9 o'clock. The children were milling about the classroom, talking at the tops of their voices. Someone had knocked over an inkwell, and from the infant's room a young finger was picking out the Teddy Bear's Picnic on the piano with excruciating inaccuracy. After we had dispatched cold pork and salad and a very sticky date pudding, which the children greeted with cries of joy, Miss Jackson set off for the Beetle. But within 10 minutes she had returned with a glum face. "No good," she announced, sinking onto the front desk. "They've got a friend coming for the weekend for fishing." "Try the Oak," I said. "Go and ring up now if you like, then you'll feel more settled." She went across the playground to my house, and at once a new child burst into the room to tell me. "That other one," she said accusingly, "has busted into your place." She was a plump, red-haired infant, obviously a sensationalist, and dying for me to take instant recriminatory action. She watched my motionless figure with growing annoyance. "Ain't you going to do nothing?" she demanded shrilly. "No," I said equably. "I said she could go in." The child looked suddenly deflated. "Oh, well," she said, shrugging her shoulders as if dismissing the whole incomprehensible affair. "If you said—" She vanished round the door, and a minute later Miss Jackson reappeared. "Hopeless. They don't take in people. Well, now what's the next move? Caxley, I suppose?" I pointed out that she and Miss Crabbe would waste a lot of time in trying to meet. Miss Jackson grew even more melancholy. "I suppose I could ask Miss Clare if I could use the sofa in the sitting room and Miss Crabbe could have my bedroom," she sighed. "It means that Miss Clare would have to do more work," I said as kindly as I could. "Oh, I'd help," responded Miss Jackson vaguely. A horrid thought had entered my head. My spare room stood ready for just such an emergency, but my heart sank at the idea of having the redoubtable Miss Crabbe at such close quarters. I knew only too well that if Miss Clare were appealed to, she would readily agree to have Miss Jackson's guests and undertake bed-making, extra cooking, and shopping without a tremor. Steeling myself, I took the plunge. "Would Miss Crabbe care to stay in my house?" I suggested. I could almost feel the draft from my guardian angel's quill as he eagerly scribbled down this rare good point in my record. Miss Jackson's dazzling smile would have been ample reward for a better-natured woman. Although I was pleased to cheer the girl after her recent misery, I was beginning to feel that the price might prove too much for me. "It would be perfect," she said. "We won't be in your way, I promise you. I know Miss Crabbe wants to go for a long tramp across the downs on Saturday, and of course she'll have to go back on Sunday." "Then that's settled," I said. "Tell her that I'm looking forward to meeting her." And in a way, I commented to myself, that is true, for my curiosity about Miss Jackson's Peregrine had frequently been whetted by my assistant's eulogies. Further discussion was cut off by the entry of a mob of children surrounding a very large, shaggy, smelly dog, which had obviously been rolling in something extremely unpleasant. "Miss, he's lost!" exclaimed Ernest, flinging his arms round the creature, which stood wagging its tail at the sensation it was causing. Another child proffered a piece of biscuit, and 2 infants patted its matted flanks with loving hands. The din was as appalling as the odor. "Take that animal out," I directed in a carrying voice. Casting sorrowful, shocked looks over their shoulders, the children and their noisome friend departed. I opened the Gothic windows to their fullest extent. "Mean old cat," floated up a low voice from outside. "She wouldn't give a home to no one, I bet." Oh, wouldn't she, I thought, as the memory of my noble but rash invitation came home to me once more. Chapter 12. Miss Crabbe descends upon Fairacre. Mrs. Pringle came, as she said, to straighten me out after school on Thursday in readiness for Miss Crabbe's visit. "These sheets'll soon need sides to middlin'," she observed dourly as we made the spare bed together. "Pity you didn't buy better quality while you was about it. Always pays in the end." I let this comment on my parsimony go by me. "And this here white paint everywhere," continued my helper morosely, "shows every speck of dust, don't it? Now, when Mrs. Hope lived here, and she was what I'd call a really clean woman, it was all done out in nice chocolate brown that never showed a mark. But there, Mrs. Hope had a feelin' for housework and dusted regular after breakfast and after tea, day in and day out." I remarked a little shortly that Mrs. Hope didn't teach all day, and then felt sorry that I had risen so easily to Mrs. Pringle's bait. We heaved the blankets up together. "There strains me back," groaned the old misery, laying one plump hand there. "If this is too much for you, Mrs. Pringle," I said firmly, "you must let me do it all alone. I don't want you laid up on my account." Mrs. Pringle's mouth took on the downward curves I know so well. "I can manage," she said with a brave, martyred sigh. "Always was a one for giving of my best cheerful." We worked together in silence for a little, and then Mrs. Pringle, changing the subject tactfully, asked me if I had heard the news about Minnie, her niece. Minnie Pringle lives at Springbourne and is the young and inconsequent mother of 3 small children. She has no husband. "She's getting married," volunteered Mrs. Pringle with pride. "Good heavens," I said, startled. "Who to?" It seemed odd to me that Minnie, having got along for all this time without the encumbrance of wedlock, should suddenly decide to regularize her position. "You wouldn't know him," said Mrs. Pringle complacently. "He's a widower chap, very steady, getting on a bit, but can enjoy a pipe and a read." This conjured up a picture of a doddering individual on the brink of the grave, and I was at a loss to think how the lively young Minnie had been attracted to him. Further disclosures enlightened me. "He's got 5 children of his own, so with Minnie's 3 it'll make a nice little family to be going on with," said Mrs. Pringle. "And Min's mother's been that awkward with her lately, it'll be best for all parties if our Min has a place of her own." "Does she seem fond of him?" I felt impelled to ask. Mrs. Pringle's answer held a wealth of worldly wisdom. "He's got a nice bit put by, and he's getting on. Min'll do right by him for the few years she has to, I don't doubt. And then there's plenty of children to look after her after." It certainly sounded reasonable enough, I thought, if not wildly passionate. I smoothed the counterpane while Mrs. Pringle puffed about the room with a duster. "Do you want this great chest of drawers heaved out?" she asked. There was a menacing streak in her voice which I chose to ignore. "Yes, please," I said. Mrs. Pringle leant gloomily against the piece of furniture, which glided easily away before such an onslaught. "One thing does worry me," confessed Mrs. Pringle as she flicked her duster. "I've been invited to that wedding, and I think I must put my hand in my pocket for a new hat." "What about the one with the cherries?" I suggested. The hat with the cherries is an old and valued friend of Fairacre's, and I felt a pang at the thought of it being put from sight forever. "Just that bit past it," announced Mrs. Pringle. "It's been a good hat. Bought it up in London, first by Miss Parr, and then give to the Primitive Jumble Sale for the Welcome Home Fund after the war. It's done me well, I must say, but I fancy a navy myself. Navy with white, say a duck's wing like, or a white lily laid across. Always looks smart." I said that it sounded just the thing. "It's to be a fairly dressy weddin'," went on Mrs. Pringle. "Min was all for a long white frock and having the children as attendants, but her mum made her see sense, and so she's got a pale blue that looks quite a treat." I agreed that this would be more suitable for Minnie. "And I'm giving an eye to Min's 3 at the back of the church while my sister sees to his 5, continued Mrs. Pringle. "Should go off very nicely. I always enjoys a weddin'." She stood motionless in the middle of my spare bedroom, duster in hand and a faraway look in her eye as she gazed across the playground. A rare and maudlin smile played across her normally grim visage. "Ah, love," she sighed gustily, "it rules the world, Miss Reed, it rules the world." It transpired that Miss Crabbe was coming by car and would arrive at Fairacre in the early evening, so that I prepared a cold supper for Miss Jackson, our guest, and myself, and went upstairs to make quite sure that the fresh rainwater filled Miss Crabbe's ewer, that her bed was turned down, and everything in readiness in the spare room. I had put a vase of my choicest roses on the bedside table and spent some time in deciding on a variety of books. After much thought, I had selected Country Things by Alison Utley, The Diary of a Provincial Lady by E.M. Delafield, Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne, an anthology of modern verse, and one of Basil Bradley's novels bearing a reclining Regency beauty on its dust jacket. And if she can't find something there to enjoy, she must be very hard to please, I said to myself. At 7 o'clock, Miss Jackson arrived looking very spruce in a new pink linen suit. She was happy and excited, the wretched John Franklin forgotten for once. It crossed my mind that Miss Crabbe might be able to help in discouraging this affair, but it remained to be seen what manner of woman she was before approaching her. "She's always terribly punctual," said Miss Jackson ardently. "She said 7:30 in her letter, so she won't be long." She followed me down the stairs, and I noticed her searching scrutiny of the supper table. All must be perfect for the approaching goddess. She appeared satisfied with what she saw, and we walked out into the schoolhouse garden, which was still warm in the July sunshine. Before long, St. Patrick's struck the half-hour, and Miss Jackson began to look anxious. But within 10 minutes, we heard a car approaching. There was a tooting, which sent Miss Jackson flying from my side to the gate, and I followed her more slowly, wondering if my mental portrait of the unknown psychology lecturer would bear any resemblance to my newly arrived guest. During supper, whilst Miss Crabbe and Miss Jackson exchanged news of college friends, and I cut innumerable slices of bread for my visitor's side plate, which seemed constantly empty, I thought how wrong I had been about Miss Crabbe's looks. I had imagined a massive woman about 6 feet in height, with flashing eyes, a resonant voice, and an overpowering presence. In fact, Miss Crabbe was a wispy 5'3", with thin, faded hair dragged back into a skimpy bun, and her most noticeable feature being a long, thin nose with a pink, flexible end which always appeared in need of attention. Her voice was slightly nasal and whining, but very soft. It flowed ruthlessly on, brooking no interruption, and appeared to function whether she were in the process of eating or not. With considerable foresight for my own catering arrangements over the weekend, I had cooked a piece of gammon and one of Mrs. Pringle's chickens. These cut cold with salad or with new potatoes and peas from the garden, I had proposed to rely on for the main meals. Miss Crabbe, with one devastating sentence, knocked all my plans askew as soon as I picked up the carving knife to attack the cold bacon. "I'm not a flesh-eater," she said in a low voice, as though discussing something of an intimate nature. I felt at once that to be a flesh-eater was to be put on a par with all the less pleasant carnivores of the animal world, and I wondered which of them, the vulture, the wolf, or the carrion crow, I most resembled. "Let me cook you an egg," I offered, "or I've plenty of cheese." Miss Crabbe smiled in a resigned fashion. "A little of this delicious salad," she said, "is all that I shall need." But I very soon found out that it wasn't. Miss Crabbe's consumption of bread was alarming, and I began to fear that I should not have enough left for breakfast. Fresh fruit followed, and when Miss Crabbe had demolished a banana, some grapes, a beauty of Bath apple, and a generous helping of raspberries from the garden, she and Miss Jackson agreed to my suggestion that coffee in the sitting room would be pleasant. They both rose from the table, still talking, and with never a backward look at the mound of dirty crockery left to me. I set the coffee on the stove and cleared the table as it heated. "This is going to be lively, Tibby," I said to the cat. We exchanged morose glances. Miss Jackson was listening entranced to Miss Crabbe's monologue when I took in the coffee. Its theme, I gathered, as I set about pouring out, was the regrettable manifestation of cruelty among children and how best to avoid them. "It must be something lacking in our own approach as teachers," asserted Miss Crabbe. Miss Jackson nodded owlishly. "Black or white?" I asked for the second time. Miss Crabbe continued, brushing aside this interruption. "Fundamentally, the good should predominate in the normal child. Certain maladjustments do occur, of course, but with the right kind of environment—" "Black or white?" I said loudly. "Black, please," muttered Miss Jackson. Miss Crabbe droned on. "Which we should be able to make for them if we as teachers are appropriately adjusted. They should be non-existent. It is to a large extent a question of aura. Now, I personally have an ambiance which I am told by my professional friends suffuses a room and creates an atmosphere conducive to a ready flow between the children and myself." "Black or white, Miss Crabbe?" I repeated fortissimo, handing Miss Jackson hers. Miss Crabbe looked at me coldly. "White, please," she said, speaking more in sorrow than in anger. Now that she had noticed my presence in the room, she seemed to feel that some conversational sop should be thrown to me. Speaking with maddening condescension, she continued with her face turned toward me. "We were discussing the little outbursts of spite which one still comes across in the classroom, petty pinchings and so on. The children, of course, are the victims of their own dominating impulses, and Hilary and I were trying to find a solution to this problem. It calls for very great delicacy in approach, I feel, an application of psychological knowledge which helps the child who has had this emotional outburst without upsetting his ego. What do you do in these cases?" "Smack," I said briefly, and at last passed the coffee. The evening wore on. By 11:15, Miss Crabbe had told us about her recent lecture tour in the northern counties, her argument with a colleague about comprehensive schools and their influence on future political developments, the reactions of the press to her recently published thesis on play behavior in the under-5s, and her suggestions for the complete reorganization of Fairacre School. Overcome as I was with mingled amusement, irritation, and fatigue, I could not help admiring the lady's amazing command of the English language. She flowed on remorselessly, her voice soft and faintly nasal. She paused neither for breath nor thought, but let her monologue stream forth like some smooth, never-ceasing, steady river which washed impassively about Miss Jackson and me as we sat helplessly in our seats. "Lounging around sufferin'," I thought, echoing Uncle Remus. Finally, I rose to collect the coffee things and suggested to Miss Jackson that she should set out on her cycle to Miss Clare's. She went with the greatest reluctance, making complicated plans about the morrow's arrangements, and I conducted Miss Crabbe to her bedroom. I showed her how to work the switch of the bedside lamp and indicated the books. She studied them briefly with a sad smile. "Juvenilia," she said, dismissing my darlings in one word. In any case, I like to spend an hour jotting down notes on my reactions to the day's affairs. I find that people take so much out of me. One gives and gives and gives. My little hour before I sleep restores my spiritual resources. Then I am refreshed enough to face the next day's demands on me. I hoped privately that my own depleted ration of sleep would refresh me enough to remain civil to my exhausting guest during the next day. Aloud, I wished her good night, closed the door gently upon her, and tottered thankfully to my own bed. The weekend slowly crawled by. Luckily, Saturday was a fine day, and the two friends set off for their walk along the downs, bearing pockets of sandwiches, carefully non-flesh in Miss Crabbe's case, and flasks. Miss Clare had invited them to tea, and so I was able to get through the usual weekend jobs undisturbed. Miss Crabbe's unceasing conversation continued unabated for the rest of the time. She had changed her plans and decided to depart during Monday morning instead of on the Sunday evening as first arranged. After tea on the Sunday, she and Miss Jackson set off for a walk. The sky looked threatening, but they refused to take mackintoshes with them. "I am unduly sensitive to weather conditions," announced Miss Crabbe, "and it certainly won't rain." It gave me some satisfaction to see the heavens open an hour or so after their departure, but I sincerely hoped that they would find shelter, for the shower was heavy and lasted a good half hour. They reappeared at about 8, and I was careful to avoid any reference to the weather. Miss Crabbe volunteered the information that they had sheltered in a cottage in the woods, and so had missed getting wet, but I did not press for further details. It was apparent, however, that something was amiss between the two. Miss Crabbe's aura was anything but benign as we sat down to supper, and Miss Jackson was visibly upset. Somewhat to my relief, she made her farewells considerably earlier than on the previous nights, and seemed anxious to get away. Miss Crabbe, too, seemed unduly thoughtful, and though she more than held her own in our civil exchanges, there was an occasional pause when the silence fell heavily about us. As 10:30 struck from St. Patrick's, Miss Crabbe ascended the stairs. On the landing, she paused and confronted me. "What is between this Franklin man and Hilary?" she demanded. Her neck had flushed an ugly red, and I was quite relieved to see that the impregnable Miss Crabbe could feel emotion as sharply as her neighbors. Before I could reply, she continued. Her voice was shriller than usual, and by the glint in her eye, I guessed that Miss Crabbe, behind an impassive veneer, had a very nasty temper. "Hilary knocked there for shelter, and it didn't take me 2 minutes to sum up that situation. The little fool's in love with him, and he's willing, too." Could it be jealousy that had brought an angry tear to this furious woman's eye? I wondered. I was soon to know. "I won't stand for it, I tell you," she almost screamed, and flounced into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Well, the weekend continues with Miss Crabbe next time.